Case 1. Juana Barraza. Born December 27, 1957 in Apazoyucan, Hidalgo, Mexico. Juana Barraza's early life was marked by hardship. Her mother, just a teenager herself, struggled with alcoholism. And accounts suggest that by age 12, Juana was forced into abuse at the hands of an older man, a trauma that would leave deep scars. Her childhood had no stable mentor, no safe harbor. Later, she adopted the persona of a wrestler, calling herself La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. This persona gave her an identity beyond her past, and she competed in local circuits, performing masked and under a silent, reserved image. Yet beneath that veil, a darker impulse stirred. By the early 2000s, reports began surfacing of elderly women found dead in their homes in Mexico City, strangled, isolated, and often robbed. The murders had a pattern, each victim elderly, living alone, dead in her apartment. The public and press began to whisper, a serial killer was at work, but authorities were slow to admit it. Psychologically, Barraza's rage is often traced to her relationship with her mother. She later claimed in interviews that she hated older women because of how her own mother had treated her, abandoning her, exposing her to abuse, and punishing her. For her, the elderly became symbolic stand-ins for the betrayal she endured. In her twisted logic, removing them from society became a kind of retribution. That path led her to plan and execute a spree of killings between roughly 2002 and 2006. In the early phase, police were reluctant to connect the deaths. Some dismissed them as isolated robberies or natural causes. When they did acknowledge a pattern, they miscast the killer as a man, perhaps a transgender individual, partly driven by gender stereotypes about violent crime. Investigators even detained dozens of transgender sex workers at one point, a move widely criticized, only to find no match in fingerprints. By late 2005, witness statements emerged. People described seeing someone leaving victims' homes, a large woman or masculine-appearing figure in a red blouse. Police also re-examined fingerprints stored in morgues, hoping to match them to suspects. The decisive breakthrough came January 25, 2006. As Juana was fleeing from the home of 82-year-old Ana Maria de los Reyes Alfaro, a tenant saw her leave the apartment just before the body was discovered. That testimony triggered pursuit and arrest. At arrest, she was carrying a stethoscope, pension forms, and a fake social services card, elements of her disguise. Investigators also matched fingerprints from crime scenes to her prints. At least 10 matches were confirmed. In her statements, Barraza admitted to killing Alfaro and several others, but denied involvement in all the homicides attributed to La Mataviejitas. Her defense maintained that she had been coerced, miscast by investigators, or sought among others. Prosecutors pushed her partial confession. During the investigation, prosecutors estimated that Barraza may have been involved in between 40 and 48 deaths, though the trial would link her to 16. In spring 2008, the case went to trial. The prosecution focused on demonstrating how Barraza used deception and emotional manipulation to gain victims' trust, then applied her strength or tools to strangle them. Witnesses, forensic evidence, and her own partial admissions were laid out. The court examined her motive: psychological resentment, early abuse, displaced anger, alongside linkages of items found at scenes. She acknowledged killing at least one woman during a dispute over pay for maid services. On March 31, 2008, she was found guilty on 16 counts of murder and aggravated burglary, including 11 separate murder charges. The court sentenced her to a total of 759 years in prison. Due to Mexican law limiting concurrent sentences, she will serve a maximum of 60 years in practice. But that still means life in captivity. At sentencing, she showed little emotional reaction. Her exact words were, "May God forgive you and not forget me." She later appealed all but one conviction. The verdict was seen by many as a measure of justice, though critics questioned whether it fully addressed all claimed murders. In prison, Barraza has been held at Santa Marta Acatitla in Mexico City. She has worked as a gym instructor and sold tacos in the prison courtyard to contribute toward her family. She also married another inmate in a state-run program for incarcerated couples, though their marriage ended after less than a year. Despite her sentence, legal commentary notes that the Mexican penal system caps effective punishment at 60 years, which means Barraza could remain incarcerated until old age. Psychological evaluation and published analysis consider her lack of admitted remorse, her narrative that society failed her, and her persistent positioning of the elderly as symbolic adversaries, factors that suggest strong antisocial traits. The case has been revisited in media and scholarship. The 2023 Netflix documentary La Dama del Silencio, El Caso Mataviejitas, examined not only her crimes, but how media, law enforcement, and social attitudes framed her narrative. Some critics argue the documentary crosses lines into sensationalism, while others say it offers necessary insight into how Mexico confronts gender, violence, and impunity. Juana Barraza's story is more than the tale of a serial killer. It's a mirror reflecting how trauma, bias, institutional neglect, and social isolation can conspire. Her victims were not just numbers. Each was a person, a life, vulnerable in a context that failed them. Case 2. Eileen Wuornos. Eileen Carol Pittman was born February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan. From the very beginning, she would face instability. Her father, Leo Pittman, was incarcerated for child molestation and later died by suicide. And her mother, Diane, abandoned her and her brother when Eileen was very young. At age 4, she and her brother were placed with their maternal grandparents, unaware until later in life that these were their grandparents. Her grandfather, an alcoholic, is documented to have abused her. In her early teens, she became pregnant and was expelled from her home. She drifted, lived in forests, hitchhiked, and eventually drifted into prostitution to survive. Her early life is not just backstory, it's the structural foundation of a psyche marked by abandonment, hypervigilance, anger, and survival. In forensic evaluations later, these traumatic roots surfaced repeatedly. Between late 1989 and late 1990, 7 middle-aged men were murdered in Central Florida. Their common link: they were traveling motorists who reportedly picked up a female hitchhiker or sex worker along rural highways. The victims included Richard Mallory, age 51, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Troy Burris, Dick Humphreys, Walter Antonio, and Peter Seams, though Seams' body was never found. In each case, there was evidence of robbery, and the victims' cars were abandoned. Wuornos later claimed that in each case she had acted in self-defense, that the men assaulted or attempted sexual violence against her. Over time, however, prosecutors argued the pattern showed something more than reactive defense, that she was murdering for gain, in opportunistic, impulsive acts. What distinguishes her from many serial killers is that her killings were not neatly premeditated or ritualistic. They appear emotionally triggered, reactive, volatile. Some forensic analysts argue she showed traits of psychopathy, lack of remorse, impulsivity, but not the full cold, manipulative profile of canonical serial killers. Others counter that the evidence reflects more a trauma-born predator, a person whose violent choices were shaped by decades of abuse, abandonment, and mental disturbance. The discovery of victims over a broad region drew mounting attention. Investigators noticed links, abandoned vehicles, remote locations, similarities in victim profiles. In early January 1991, law enforcement began surveillance in hotspots. Undercover detectives posed as clients or traffickers in areas where Wuornos was known to work. On January 5, 1991, police located Wuornos and her partner Tyria Moore in a Port Orange pub called The Last Resort. After tracing warrants under various aliases, she was arrested on January 9th. Moore was granted immunity in exchange for cooperation and eventually helped authorities secure a confession. Investigators used phone calls, evidence from victims' belongings found in Wuornos' possession, ballistic tests, and matching trajectory patterns. One key element: penalties for wrongful confession were softened when Moore's testimony exposed the pattern. Wuornos eventually gave a full confession on January 16, 1991, via phone calls back and forth with Moore. Once in custody, Wuornos underwent extensive psychological evaluation. In 1992, Dr. Harry et al. Produced a report concluding she suffered from delusional disorder. Persecutory type. The examiner noted that as sessions progressed, Wuornos became increasingly paranoid, developing a delusional system. Other experts analyzed her history of extreme trauma, borderline personality disorder traits, antisocial traits, and PTSD symptoms. Her defense would press these mental health claims. that at least some murders were reactive, that her capacity to pre-plan was impaired, and that her history of sexual and physical abuse should mitigate her culpability. The prosecution countered. Despite her psychiatric diagnoses, her confessions, ballistic evidence, pattern consistency, and motives for robbery supported the claim of calculated homicide in several instances. Her first murder trial centered on Richard Mallory, killing in November 1989. The prosecution depicted motive, robbery, sequence, and ballistic evidence as consistent with homicide for gain, not self-defense. The defense tried to introduce evidence that Mallory had a prior record for attempted rape, but that was excluded in the trial. Wuornos's own testimony was inconsistent and challenged by investigators, so credibility was undermined. She was convicted in 1992 and sentenced to death. Over the next years, she entered no contest pleas in other murder counts, in part to avoid further trials, receiving additional death sentences. Her appeals reached the Florida Supreme Court, which in Wuornos v. State, 1994, upheld the conviction and death penalty. That court affirmed that the aggravating circumstances, like robbery during murder, were proven, while acknowledging mitigating factors, alcoholism, childhood abuse, impaired mental state, should be weighed, but held they did not override the gravity of her crimes. In later appeals and motions, her defense challenged the effectiveness of counsel for failing to present additional mitigation or competence evidence. In Wuornos v. State, the court reviewed those claims and found no reversible error. As late as 2001, Wuornos herself attempted to fire her attorneys and skip further appeals, declaring she would go to death row. The Florida governor ordered fresh psychiatric exams. 3 independent psychiatrists deemed her competent to be executed. On October 9, 2002, after nearly a decade on death row, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She declined a final meal, requesting only coffee. Her last words claimed she would come back in a larger cosmic sense, referencing Jesus and the Rock. While on death row, she was legally adopted by a Christian woman, Arlene Prally, who sought to offer advocacy and support. Her case became the subject of documentaries and films, notably Monster, 2003, where Charlize Theron won an Oscar for portraying her. In the decades after, her story has been debated. Was she a cold-blooded serial killer or a severely traumatized woman pushed beyond the edge? The truth is complex. One of the most compelling questions: was Aileen Wuornos a psychopath or a victim whose brakes turned violent? Research is divided. Some argue she showed classic antisocial traits, predatory aggression, and rational capacity consistent with serial homicide. Others emphasize the severe childhood abuse, borderline traits, PTSD, hypervigilance, emotional instability, and delusional episodes, arguing she was not a cold, calculating killer, but one whose survival response became destructive. Her personality assessments: she is thought to have met criteria for borderline personality disorder, possibly antisocial traits, and had delusional thinking. In the evaluation, as she engaged with examiners, she became more paranoid and developed a structured delusion system. From a prevention and awareness lens, her story teaches us how untreated trauma, abuse, neglect, and mental illness can metastasize into destructive behavior if no intervention occurs. Early interventions, mental health support, trauma-informed therapy for abuse survivors, access to stable social support, may reduce the risk of violence in vulnerable individuals. We must strengthen systems for reporting abuse, for trauma recovery, and for equitable mental health care. Her case also spotlights how the criminal justice system handles female perpetrators, mental health claims, and the philosophical tension between punishment and rehabilitation. The legal process in her case attempted to balance mitigation, childhood abuse, mental disorder, with aggravation, robbery, multiple victims. The courts ultimately gave more weight to pattern, evidence, and public safety than to mitigation. Aileen Wuornos's life is not a macabre curiosity. It is a cautionary story about human fragility, how a battered mind fractures, and how systems, familial, societal, legal, respond when someone teeters toward violence. Case 3. Rosemary West. Rose West was born Rosemary Pauline Letts in 1953 in Devon, England. Her early years were troubled. Her father reportedly suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and wielded strict, violent control over his children. Her mother, isolated and emotionally unstable, left the home, leaving Rose in a chaotic environment. Some biographers suggest that in adolescence Rose began exhibiting provocative behavior, possibly as a way to exert control in a life she otherwise felt powerless in. At age 15, standing at a bus stop, she met Fred West, then 27. Their age gap and the power dynamics already suggest an imbalance. She soon became a caregiver to his children, then his partner. Over time, their relationship evolved into a shared partnership in escalating depravity. Many experts describe their union as a fusion of two disturbed personalities. Fred, with early violent behavior and a history of sexual abuse and likely deviant impulses. Rose, offering a willing partner who supplied emotional, logistical, and even physical collaboration. Their relationship allowed deviant fantasies to be enacted within the safety of domestic space. The turning point came gradually. Over the 1970s and 1980s, victims began to emerge. Vulnerable women, often hitchhikers, lodgers seeking work or shelter, individuals isolated and less likely to be missed immediately. One known victim, Lucy Partington, was taken from a bus stop, enticed into what seemed a harmless journey, and brought to the West's home. Yet for years, no full suspicion was cast. Rose's outward persona and the couple's social conformity shielded them, making detection difficult. By the early 1990s, whispers began. One key thread: missing persons. Their daughter Heather had vanished in 1987. The parents offered shifting stories about her whereabouts. In time, their other children began hinting of a family joke. Misbehavior would lead to ending up under the patio, referencing Heather's disappearance. That disturbing phrase, long dismissed as morbid humor, spurred investigators to act. Inside the home, investigators found layers of deception: sealed floors, altered rooms, inconsistent structural renovations. Social services, tipped by the children's statements to a stranger, had initially opened inquiries. Detective constables began to question whether those jokes held truth. In February 1994, police obtained a search warrant to excavate the garden and basement of 25 Cromwell Street. What they expected to find was one body. What they found was many. Heather's remains under the patio, plus bones and fragments in the cellar and garden. Over time, the team uncovered the remains of 10 victims, all pointing to a carefully hidden pattern of burial and concealment. Investigators were meticulous. Forensic anthropologists, archaeologists, and crime scene analysts worked to assemble timelines, match dental and skeletal records, estimate time of death, and map who had access to what part of the house at certain dates. They also studied the couple's purchase and renovation records, travel logs, utility bills. Every discrepancy became a lead. Over months, a mosaic formed. Rose's presence was detected at crucial times: possession of keys, movement of materials. Efforts were also made to trace every handyman or materials supplier who entered the property, establishing that structural changes had been made to hide evidence. One survivor, Caroline Owens, had earlier escaped from the West's home, providing testimony about her captivity. During the trial and pretrial hearings, her account was a pillar in proving that Rose was not merely in the background, but actively participating. By late 1994, Fred was arrested and charged with multiple murders and sexual offenses. Rose likewise was charged. The net closed. The household known to so many as domestic was exposed as a crime scene. Originally, both were to be tried. But on January 1, 1995, before trial, Fred West committed suicide in prison. That shift placed the full burden of accountability on Rose, though prosecutors argued she had been indispensable to the crimes. Her trial opened in October 1995 in Winchester Crown Court. She faced 10 counts of murder, including the killings at Cromwell Street and the earlier murder of her stepdaughter, Charmaine, in 1971. From the start, Rose denied involvement. She contended that Fred was the primary actor, and she was manipulated, or at worst an accessory acting under duress. But the prosecution, aided by structural and forensic evidence, characterized her as an active co-conspirator, someone who helped carry out planning, execution, and disposal. Witnesses included the surviving children, expert forensic teams, and the earlier surviving victim, Owens. Owens testified about Rose's direct engagement, describing scenes where Rose participated in restraint or assault. The forensic experts explained how skeletal fragments were deposited in patterns consistent with simultaneous control and burial. Medical pathologists described pre-death injuries and timing consistent with joint activity. The cumulative weight of correlation, structural logs, purchase receipts, access patterns, overlapping presence, overwhelmed defense efforts to isolate Fred. Rose's defense team, led by Leo Goatley, argued her client was not the root actor. Goatley later reflected that Rose could appear disarmingly calm, cooperative, and, within confined contexts, almost normal. But he faced the difficulty that the case demanded explaining how that calm could coexist with the enormity of the acts alleged. In November 1995, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Rose West was guilty on all 10 counts of murder. In December, she was sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning she would never be released. The judge stated that the severity and nature of the crimes left no room for parole. Her subsequent appeals, in 1996 and through applications to the Criminal Cases Review Commission in 2001, were all denied. Her conviction remained intact. Rose West challenges neat classification. Was she a psychopath, a willing sadist, or was she trapped within Fred's dominant personality? Many forensic psychologists assert she held more agency than she ever publicly admitted. One view holds that Rose's early trauma and abuse, combined with personality traits of manipulation, need for control, and eroticized violence, predisposed her to partner with Fred, not just as a follower, but as a collaborator. The safety of her role as mother and housewife allowed her to mask darker impulses. In interviews, she could be calm, articulate, emotionally distant, traits sometimes seen in psychopathy. Another perspective warns of oversimplification. Her defense lawyer contended that, outside the domain of extreme crime, Rose held moments of outward normalcy, engaging in benign conversations, maintaining routines, forming bonds with prison staff or chaplains. That duality, a person who can present as ordinary while capable of extreme violence, is precisely the chilling gap investigators and psychologists must study. In her correspondence and in interviews, Rose has continued to maintain innocence, framing herself as a scapegoat for Fred. That posture aligns with narcissistic defense and detachment. Whether belief or strategy, it persists. Rose West remains incarcerated at HM Prison New Hall in West Yorkshire, under strict conditions. She is one of the few in the UK serving a whole life sentence. Her case has had ripple effects. The demolition of 25 Cromwell Street in 1996 erased the physical structure, but not the memory. Rose West's life and crimes confront us with a central paradox: how someone who lived through familial dysfunction, survived neglect, and integrated into motherhood could cross into a realm of horror. But she did. And in partnership, not isolation, with Fred West. As we step away from the corridors of Cromwell Street, we carry a challenge to communities, to law enforcement, to mental health services, to notice what's hidden, to believe unlikely voices, to correlate anomalies, and to intervene before tragedy takes root. The real victory is not in the sentence, but in prevention. Let this story strengthen watchfulness, compassion, and resolve, so that fewer lives are lost to darkness hiding behind domesticity. Case 4. Myra Hindley. Myra Hindley was born in 1942 in Crumpsall, Manchester, to a family scarred by instability. Her father, an alcoholic and often violent, imparted lessons of toughness and control, but also fear. As a child, Myra spent years in the care of her grandmother. Later, she described a cold distance toward the suffering of others. She once claimed that seeing someone injured didn't bother her. She left school early, converted to Catholicism, and became a secretary. At 18, she met Ian Brady at her workplace. Brady was bookish, troubled, intense. Their relationship became a crucible in which her suppressed impulses, loyalty, and identity merged with his darker fantasies. Under his influence, she adopted ideologies, read extremist literature, dyed her hair, and gradually became enmeshed in a plan she may never have fully understood, or perhaps understood too well. Psychologically, Hindley presents a challenge. Was she a cold accomplice, a coerced participant, or a willing collaborator? Her diaries suggest fascination, devotion, and a relentless need for approval. "He is cruel and selfish, and I love him," she once wrote. Over time, she claimed she was manipulated, that Brady held the reins. But evidence suggests she was more than passive. She lured victims, burned incriminating letters, and stood by while crimes unfolded. In criminal psychology terms, one might view Hindley as a hybrid, part dependent accomplice, part autonomous actor. Her identity was subsumed in the relationship with Brady, a phenomenon sometimes called folie à deux, or shared psychosis. But she was not simply a victim of his madness. She made choices. Between July 1963 and October 1965, Brady and Hindley abducted and murdered 5 children and teenagers aged between 10 and 17. The victims were Pauline Reed, John Kilbride, Keith Bennett, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. 2 bodies were found on Saddleworth Moor in 1965. A 3rd grave was discovered in 1987. Keith Bennett's body has never been located, despite decades of searches. Their method followed a chilling pattern. Hindley would sometimes approach children with an innocent request, "Help me look for something lost, a lift home," and drive them toward remote moorlands. Brady would follow, and the crime would be committed. The duo buried bodies in shallow graves on the moors. Police initially had no leads connecting Hindley, but the breakthrough came in October 1965. Hindley's brother-in-law, David Smith, witnessed Brady murdering Edward Evans in the front room of their house. Terrified, he helped clean up and then reported it to authorities, triggering the unraveling of darker crimes. When police searched the couple's home and Brady's belongings, they found incriminating evidence. A suitcase full of photographs showing Hindley and Brady on the moors, pornographic pictures of Leslie Ann Downey, and a tape recording of her final moments. That tape, played in court, devastated public consciousness. Detectives also uncovered a notebook with John Kilbride inscribed, tying Hindley directly to another victim's disappearance. Faced with mounting evidence, police arrested Hindley, initially charged her as an accessory. The investigation was methodical. Forensic searches of moorland, interviews, sifting diaries and letters, listening to recorded confessions. In later years, Hindley assisted police in revisiting the moor, though the effort was controversial and its usefulness debated. On 27 April 1966, in Chester Crown Court, Hindley and Brady stood trial. They pleaded not guilty to the murders of Evans, Downey, and Kilbride. Brady was convicted on all 3 murder counts. Hindley was convicted of 2 murders, Downey and Evans, and of being an accessory for Kilbride. Crucially, they avoided the death penalty because capital punishment had already been abolished in 1965. During testimony, the tape of Downey's recorded final moments was played, a piece of evidence so charged it contributed decisively to their convictions. Brady frequently remained silent or defiant. Hindley sometimes distanced herself, claiming limited involvement. The judge described Brady as wicked beyond belief. Hindley's public persona was swiftly painted as emblematic of betrayal, especially because as a woman, her role violated deeply held social expectations of care and maternal instinct. Sentencing followed. Brady received concurrent life sentences. Hindley was handed 2 life sentences plus 7 years for her accessory role. Over the years, Hindley appealed but was denied. She served her sentence in full, launched campaigns for parole, claimed remorse, and later, in 1987, confessed to involvement in all 5 murders, including the earlier ones for which she had not been convicted publicly. Some investigators and commentators viewed her confession as calculated, what one detective called a performance. While in prison, Hindley severed communications with Brady in 1971. She developed relationships with prison staff and even petitioned to be reclassified to lower security level, a move that sparked controversy about rehabilitation and dangerousness. Prison warders reported tensions. Hindley was intellectually exacting, requested obscure books, often about Nazism or occult themes, and occasionally made romantic overtures to one warder, Patricia Cairns. Over time, she became a figure of intense public hatred. Her repeated parole requests were met with scorn, rarely considered seriously. In November 2002, Hindley died in prison from bronchial pneumonia at age 60. Her applications for cremation were refused by multiple funeral directors, reflecting how deeply her crimes resonated with public outrage. Though indictments ended decades ago, the case still raises unresolved questions. The body of Keith Bennett remains missing. Investigations and searches continue, bolstered by renewed documentary efforts and newly surfaced documents, as families still seek closure. More than 50 years have passed since those crimes, yet the name Myra Hindley still echoes across time. as warning, as enigma, as tragedy. Her story reminds us that evil is not always monstrous in appearance. It can be intimate, relational, seductive, patient. Case 5. Jodi Arias. It was June 2008 when 30-year-old Travis Alexander disappeared from his home in Mesa, Arizona. 5 days later, his body was discovered. What followed was not simply a murder investigation, but a labyrinth of conflicting stories, shifting narratives, and a courtroom where every word could mean life or death. Investigators would slowly zero in on the last person known to have seen Travis alive, his former girlfriend, Jodi Arias. In that first phase, law enforcement had to move carefully. The crime scene was compromised by time. Decomposition had set in, evidence was degrading, and unknowns loomed large. Yet some critical pieces remained: digital forensics, DNA traces, and the victim's own camera, damaged but not destroyed, that would later become a turning point in the case. Their challenge was to separate what was true from what was invented. From the outset, Jodi's story shifted, first denying involvement entirely, then alleging masked intruders, and finally framing her version as one of self-defense. That shifting testimony would become a central battleground in the courtroom. To understand how this case gripped the public, we must peer into the psychology of the person at its center. Jodi Ann Arias was not previously criminally inclined. She had no record. But in post-trial analysis, several threads emerge: an intense longing for connection, a suspicion of betrayal, and a readiness to rewrite her own narrative when confronted with contradiction. Experts in the trial testified that Arias displayed signs of what one might call narrative flexibility, the ability to reshape her account to match the evidence as it appeared. That kind of shifting story is often a red flag for investigators. It suggests she was living in two worlds, one in her mind, where she needed to protect her own identity and image, and one in objective reality, where evidence pressed her back against the wall. Defense psychologists attempted to show that Jodi was vulnerable, emotionally fragile, possibly suffering trauma from alleged abuse, and subject to severe stress during confrontation. Meanwhile, the prosecution painted a different portrait: someone capable of planning, with motive, and with awareness of risk. The tension between those portrayals would be central in the courtroom. When the trial opened in January 2013, it became more than a legal proceeding. It became a spectacle. Live cameras broadcast every twist. Jurors were drawn from across Arizona. The prosecution leaned on an array of forensic evidence. Among the most compelling, time-stamped photographs recovered from Travis's camera, even though the device had been washed and partially destroyed. There were striking images showing intimate moments earlier in the day, and critically, one that appeared to depict a figure in the bathroom after the attack. Investigators also presented DNA evidence tying Jodi to blood at the scene, as well as a palm print matching hers. Communications, texts, emails, voicemails, revealed a volatile relationship punctuated by jealousy, pleas, and accusations. These digital footprints gave prosecutors a narrative of motive. Travis was moving on. Jodi feared abandonment. The defense, in turn, introduced testimony about alleged prior abuse, emotional trauma, and the mental state Jodi claimed she entered that night. On the stand, she admitted lying in earlier phases, and the jury got to hear her account for 18 days. She portrayed a moment of panic, fear, and self-defense, saying she only intended to escape, not to kill. This trial was not just a battle of facts. It was psychological theater. Every pause, every tear, every inconsistency scrutinized by millions watching. In May 2013, after about 15 hours of jury deliberation, the verdict came: guilty of first-degree murder. Every juror agreed she had acted intentionally, not accidentally. But when it came to the punishment phase, the jury could not agree unanimously on whether she should receive the death penalty. The result? A mistrial in that phase. A second penalty trial followed in late 2014, again featuring competing narratives about Jodi's personality, mental state, and capacity for harm. Expert witnesses debated whether she was irredeemable or a wounded person deserving of mitigation. But once again, the jury hung. At that point, legal rules removed the death penalty as an option, and the judge was empowered to issue the sentence. On April 13, 2015, the judge sentenced Jodi Arias to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole after 25 years. In her allocution, she expressed regret and held up a white Survivor t-shirt, offering her voice to victims of abuse, but without denying responsibility. As of today, Jodi Arias serves her sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex. She has appealed. Legal complications slowed review due to transcript and record issues. While incarcerated, she is engaged in certain activities, artwork sales, creating content, and occasional legal filings seeking relief. Some observe that this dual life, convicted inmate and artistic creator, fits the earlier theme. Someone continuously reshaping narrative, seeking new identity, even from behind bars. But the central truth remains. Behind every high-profile trial lies human cost. Travis Alexander lost his life. His family lost a brother, a friend, a connection. The legal system bore the burden of trying to restore balance where nothing could fully heal. Case 6. Karla Homolka. Karla Leanne Homolka was born in May 1970 in Mississauga, Ontario. She was, by many accounts, a capable student who later earned a BA in psychology. She worked part-time at a veterinary clinic, had a love for animals, and held a seemingly ordinary suburban life. In 1987, at age 17, she met Paul Bernardo, then 23. Their connection seemed unremarkable at first, but over time, Bernardo revealed to Karla fantasies and urges so severe that they would eventually manifest in real life. According to some forensic assessments, Karla showed traits of hybristophilia, a psychological phenomenon where a person is drawn to another who commits violent acts. Some psychiatrists called her a diagnostic mystery, noting her ability to present as harmless while harboring a moral vacuity deep within. Here lies a critical question. Did Karla follow Bernardo, or did she find in him the outlet for a latent darkness? Scholars and mental health professionals have grappled with that question. Her skill in managing appearances, blonde hair, polite manners, social acceptability, became a mask that concealed her darker involvement. The criminal partnership began in earnest in December 1990. That month, Karla and Paul turned their attention to Karla's own younger sister Tammy, then aged 15. In an act that would later become central in forensic debate. They drugged Tammy, first via Valium and food, then using an anesthetic agent Karla had stolen. The young girl was unconscious, vulnerable. During their assault, Tammy began choking on her vomit and died. The death was initially ruled an accident. Tammy's death marked a turning point. Though not initially treated as homicide, the case would later be reopened once the true extent of Karla and Bernardo's crimes surfaced. In June 1991, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey disappeared. The police eventually recovered her remains wrapped in concrete blocks, dumped in Lake Gibson. That same month, Bernardo and Homolka had their wedding, a symbolic moment of darkness hidden in plain view. A year later, in April 1992, they abducted 15-year-old Kristen French. She was held, assaulted, and later murdered. Her body was discovered in a ditch in Burlington. As the investigation advanced, forensic science began linking Bernardo to a string of rapes known as the Scarborough Rapist incidents. DNA, victim testimony, and breakpoint patterns connected him to assaults that preceded the murders. Investigators also discovered videotapes made inside the Bernardo Homolka household. Those tapes, once suppressed, would become key leverage in the courtroom. By May 1993, prosecutors and Karla's legal team struck what would become a controversial plea deal. In exchange for her full testimony against Bernardo, Karla agreed to plead guilty to manslaughter, not murder. The Crown expected her cooperation to convict Bernardo. On May 18th, she was formally arraigned on 2 counts of manslaughter. The deal granted a 12-year sentence, with eligibility for parole after 3. The public and media quickly branded it a deal with the devil. One legal ethical storm erupted around the handling of the videotapes. Defense counsel delayed their disclosure, sparking claims of misconduct and obstruction. At trial, Karla testified, including about key episodes, and her testimony ruptured her self-portrayal as a passive or coerced partner. One puzzling tension was whether she was dominated or complicit. Prosecutors pressed her memory, motives, actions. Meanwhile, Bernardo's defense sought to impeach her credibility using the very tapes she had fought to protect. On July 6, 1993, she was sentenced to 12 years. In a preliminary hearing held on June 28, details of evidence and suppressed facts were vetted under a narrow publication ban, a decision made to protect Bernardo's right to fair trial. Meanwhile, Bernardo faced multiple first-degree murder charges, kidnapping, aggravated sexual assault, dismemberment counts, among others. His trial would run separately. In prison, Carla served the 12-year sentence, possibly in a psychiatric facility for part. On July 4, 2005, she was released unconditionally, having served her legal term. Even after her release, the legal supervision lasted years. Restrictions, name change requests. She attempted to become Emily Chiara Tremblay, were rejected, and courts reviewed her conditions. In November 2005, Quebec's Superior Court removed the remaining restrictions, and the Court of Appeal upheld that decision. In the public domain, outrage erupted. Victims' families, advocacy groups, and citizens decried the plea deal and Carla's relatively short sentence for her role in such serious crimes. Some saw her as escaping true accountability. Some defenders of the deal argued prosecuting Bernardo would have been far harder without her testimony. The risk that Bernardo might avoid conviction entirely was real. The Crown viewed the compromise as a tool to ensure justice, at least for Bernardo. But to many Canadians, the ethical cost was steep. The Carla Homolka case raises critical questions for psychology, law enforcement, and prevention. How do we detect a person who can present as normal yet enable or participate in extreme crimes? How do we draw boundaries between victim and perpetrator? When you look at this case today, see beyond the lurid headlines. Reflect on the investigative challenges, the moral dilemmas in plea bargaining, and the urgent need for prevention. Our goal is not prurient curiosity but public awareness and protection.